John Harper had always considered himself a man of routine, someone who thrived on order and harmony. His life was predictable, but in the best possible way. Every morning, he woke up at 6:30 a.m., brewed a strong cup of coffee, and sat on his porch, watching the sun rise over the calm waters of the lake that bordered his neighborhood. The view never failed to bring him peace. It was one of the reasons he'd chosen this place when he first moved in over a decade ago. The community was small but tight-knit, filled with families who cared about keeping their surroundings beautiful. John wasn't just a resident. He was one of the founding members of the neighborhood's homeowners association, HOA. Back then, everyone pitched in to create guidelines that would ensure the area stayed clean, safe, and visually appealing. He remembered those early days vividly. The long meetings, the heated debates, and the compromises they all made to keep things running smoothly. At the time, it felt like they were building something special together. John worked as a marine engineer during the week, a job that kept him busy, but also allowed him to indulge in his passion for boats. On weekends, you could almost always find him working on Asterisk, the Serenity Asterisk, his prized possession. It wasn't the fanciest boat on the lake, but it held years of memories. Family fishing trips, quiet afternoons spent drifting on the water, and even a few solo adventures when life got overwhelming. To John, Asterisk, the Serenity Asterisk wasn't just a boat. It was an extension of himself. One Saturday morning, as John sipped his coffee and admired the golden sunlight dancing across the lake, he noticed a white envelope tucked under his doormat. Curious, he picked it up and flipped it over. The return address read Lakeside Community HOA. Frowning slightly, he tore open the envelope and pulled out a single sheet of paper. As his eyes scanned the official-looking letter, his stomach sank. It was a violation notice. According to the letter, John had broken Section 3.2b of the HOA guidelines. No boats shall be stored within visible sightlines of common areas. The tone of the letter was polite but firm, instructing him to remove the boat from his driveway immediately or face further action. John blinked, rereading the sentence several times to make sure he hadn't misunderstood. Surely, this had to be some kind of mistake. He glanced toward his driveway, where Asterisk, the Serenity Asterisk, rested under its usual blue tarp. There it was, plain as day, exactly where it had been for months. Nothing had changed. No new complaints from neighbors, no warnings beforehand. Just this sudden accusation. John felt a mix of emotions bubbling inside him. Confusion, frustration, and a growing sense of irony. Little did he know, the situation was about to take an unexpected turn. After all, what the letter didn't mention, and what John hadn't thought about in years, was that he was the one who had written that very rule 10 years ago. John sat on his porch, the violation letter still clutched in his hand. He stared at it as if hoping the words would rearrange themselves into something less accusatory. The gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the trees lining his yard, but John barely noticed. His mind was racing, trying to piece together how this could have happened. He thought back to the early days of the neighborhood, when everything was new and raw with potential. Back then, the community had been a blank slate, full of promise but also challenges. Neighbors were excited to live in such a beautiful location, but differences in lifestyle quickly became apparent. Some people parked their cars haphazardly on the street, while others left old furniture or tools lying around their yards. And then there were the boats. Several residents owned them, and not everyone stored them neatly. Ugly metal trailers and tarps dotted driveways, drawing complaints from neighbors who felt these eyesores disrupted the serene aesthetic of the lakeside. At the time, John had taken it upon himself to address the issue. As a founding member of the HOA, he'd spent countless hours attending meetings and listening to both sides of the argument. On one hand, boat owners argued that they needed easy access to their vessels for weekend outings. On the other hand, non-boat owners insisted that visible storage ruined the neighborhood's charm. It was a classic clash of priorities, and finding a solution required compromise. That's when John came up with Section 3.2b, The rule stated that no boats could be stored within sightlines of common areas unless explicitly approved by the HOA board. At the time, it seemed like a fair resolution. Boat owners could still keep their vessels nearby, but only if they ensured they weren't blatantly visible to passersby. For those unwilling or unable to comply, off-site storage options were recommended. Everyone agreed to the terms, and for years, the regulation worked without much fuss. But now, sitting on his porch with the violation notice in hand, John realized he'd completely forgotten about the rule he himself had written. Life had moved on, and so had he. Over the years, he'd grown accustomed to parking the Serenity in his driveway, assuming it wasn't causing any trouble. He hadn't received complaints before, nor had anyone mentioned it during casual chats with neighbors. So why was this coming up now? As John mulled over the situation, a memory surfaced, one he hadn't thought about in ages. During the initial discussions about boat storage, he'd faced pushback from a few vocal residents who worried the rule might be too restrictive. To ease their concerns, John had added a small clause allowing exceptions for homeowners who could demonstrate good cause or significant contributions to the community. At the time, it felt like a minor detail, almost an afterthought. But now, it nagged at him. Could this forgotten clause be the key to resolving his predicament? Feeling a mix of guilt and determination, John decided to dig deeper. He went inside, retrieved a box of old documents from the attic, and began sifting through faded papers and dusty files. Each document brought back fragments of the past, the debates, the compromises, the shared goal of creating a harmonious neighborhood. As he uncovered notes from those early meetings, John couldn't help but feel a pang of nostalgia. They had built something meaningful together, but somewhere along the way, the spirit of cooperation had faded. Little did John know, revisiting the origins of Section 3.2b would lead him down a path far more complicated and ultimately rewarding than he ever imagined. The next day, John decided it was time to face the HOA head-on. He couldn't just ignore the violation notice or hope it would go away on its own. Instead, he prepared himself to attend the upcoming HOA meeting, where he planned to explain his side of the story and clear up what he saw as a simple misunderstanding. After all, how could anyone hold him accountable for breaking a rule he didn't even remember creating? Surely, once he explained the situation, the matter would be resolved quickly. When the evening of the meeting arrived, John walked into the community center feeling confident but slightly uneasy. The room was already buzzing with conversation as neighbors greeted each other and took their seats around the large wooden table. Some smiled warmly at John, while others avoided eye contact altogether. He felt a strange tension in the air, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why. Maybe it was because this wasn't just any ordinary agenda item. It involved him, someone who had always been seen as a model resident. As the meeting began, the chairperson called for order and started going through the usual updates about landscaping schedules and holiday decorations. Finally, they'd reached the topic of violations, and John's name was mentioned. The chairperson summarized the issue briefly. John Harper has received a violation notice regarding Section 3.2b of our guidelines. His boat is currently visible from common areas, which is against HOA policy. John cleared his throat and raised his hand. I'd like to address this, he said calmly, standing up. He explained that he hadn't intended to break any rules and that he'd simply overlooked the regulation over the years. Then, hesitating slightly, he added, "To be honest, I actually helped write that rule 10 years ago." The room fell silent for a moment. A few people exchanged glances, some looking surprised, others skeptical. But before John could elaborate further, one of the newer residents spoke up. "That doesn't change the fact that the rule exists," the man said firmly. "If we let one person bend the rules, everyone will expect the same treatment." John nodded, trying to stay composed. "I understand," he replied. "But I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm just pointing out that there might be flexibility here if we look at the bigger picture. Unfortunately, his words didn't seem to resonate. Another neighbor chimed in, her tone sharp. "It's not about you, John. It's about fairness. If we make exceptions for you, we'll have to do the same for everyone else." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. John felt a knot tighten in his stomach. This wasn't going the way he'd hoped. Even longtime friends, who had known him since the neighborhood's early days, seemed hesitant to speak up in his defense. One woman leaned forward and said gently, "John, we know you're a good neighbor, but rules are rules. We can't pick and choose when to enforce them." Her words stung, not because they were harsh, but because they came from someone he trusted. By the end of the discussion, it was clear that most attendees weren't willing to budge. They thanked John for bringing the issue to light, but emphasized the importance of consistency. As the meeting adjourned, John lingered behind, watching as people filed out of the room. He felt a mix of emotions: frustration, disappointment, and even a touch of embarrassment. How had things escalated so quickly? And why did it feel like no one was listening? On the drive home, John replayed the meeting in his mind. He realized that the problem wasn't just about the boat, it was about perception. To many of his neighbors, he now represented someone who was flouting the very rules he'd helped create. Whether intentionally or not, he'd become a symbol of hypocrisy. That realization hit him hard, but it also sparked something else: determination. If his neighbors wouldn't listen tonight, he'd find another way to make them understand. That night, as John lay awake staring at the ceiling, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd missed something important. The meeting had left him frustrated and disheartened, but deep down, he knew there was more to uncover. If he wanted to resolve this situation, he needed to dig deeper, not just into the rule itself, but into the spirit behind it. Early the next morning, while the neighborhood was still quiet, John headed up to his attic. It was a space he rarely visited, filled with boxes of old documents, faded photographs, and relics from the past. Dust motes floated lazily in the dim light as he pulled out a large cardboard box labeled HOA files. Inside were stacks of papers, meeting minutes, draft proposals, handwritten notes, and even a few coffee-stained napkins scribbled with ideas during late-night discussions. As he sifted through the contents, memories came rushing back. He remembered the passionate debates over property aesthetics, the compromises struck to keep everyone happy, and the shared sense of accomplishment when the guidelines were finally approved. It had been a labor of love, born out of a desire to create harmony in their little lakeside community. But buried beneath all those memories was something John hadn't thought about in years: the exception clause. He found it tucked away in a yellow document, a brief paragraph added almost as an afterthought during one of the final meetings. The clause allowed for exceptions if a homeowner could demonstrate good cause or provide evidence of significant contributions to the community. At the time, John had included it to ensure the rules remained flexible enough to accommodate unique situations. He never imagined it would come back to haunt, or perhaps save, him. Armed with this discovery, John began piecing together a plan. He realized that simply reminding people of his role in creating the rule wouldn't be enough. What he needed to do was reconnect with his neighbors on a personal level, reminding them of the values that had brought them together in the first place. Over the next few days, he reached out to key members of the HOA board and some of the vocal critics from the meeting. Instead of confronting them directly, he invited them for casual conversations, coffee at the local cafe, a walk by the lake, or even a quick chat over the fence. During these discussions, John didn't focus on defending himself. Instead, he shared stories about the early days of the neighborhood, recounting the challenges they'd faced and the solutions they'd crafted together. He talked about how proud he was of what they'd built and how much he valued the sense of community they'd fostered. Slowly but surely, he began to see a shift in their attitudes. The tension softened, replaced by curiosity and even a hint of nostalgia. One neighbor, Sarah, admitted during their conversation that she hadn't realized John was involved in drafting the original rules. "You know," she said thoughtfully, It's easy to forget where these guidelines came from. Sometimes we get so caught up in enforcing them that we lose sight of why they exist in the first place. Her words gave John hope. By revisiting the origins of the rule and reigniting the spirit of collaboration, he was planting seeds of understanding. And though he still had work to do, he felt more optimistic than he had in days. The journey wasn't over, but for the first time since receiving that violation notice, John believed there might be a way forward, one rooted in empathy, respect, and a renewed commitment to working together. Over the next few weeks, John threw himself into rebuilding connections with his neighbors. He knew that solving the boat issue wasn't just about finding a loophole or bending the rules. It was about restoring trust and reminding everyone of the shared values that had made their community special in the first place. Every conversation, no matter how small, became an opportunity to bridge the gap between resentment and understanding. One afternoon, John met with Greg, a newer resident who had been particularly vocal during the HOA meeting. Greg was skeptical at first, but as they sat on John's porch sipping lemonade, John shared stories about the neighborhood's early days. He talked about the challenges they'd faced, how messy disputes over property lines and noise levels nearly tore the community apart, and how they'd come together to create guidelines that balanced individual freedoms with collective harmony. "You know," John said with a smile, "we didn't write those rules to make life harder for each other. We wrote them because we wanted this place to feel like home, for everyone." Greg nodded slowly, his expression softening. "I guess I never thought about it that way," he admitted. "It's easy to see the rules as restrictions instead of, well, tools to keep things running smoothly." By the end of their chat, Greg agreed to bring up the idea of flexibility at the next HOA meeting. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was progress. Encouraged by this small victory, John continued reaching out to others. He invited Sarah, the neighbor who had spoken thoughtfully about losing sight of the rule's original purpose, to join him for a walk around the lake. As they strolled along the water's edge, she confessed that many residents felt caught between sticking to the letter of the law and making exceptions based on compassion. "It's not black and white," Sarah said. "Sometimes doing what's fair means bending a little. But people are afraid that if we start making exceptions, it'll open the floodgates." John listened carefully, nodding in agreement. "That's why I think we need to focus on the spirit of the rule, not just the words," he replied. "If we can show that flexibility doesn't mean chaos, maybe more people will be willing to give it a chance." As word spread about John's efforts, curiosity began to replace hostility. Neighbors started approaching him, not to argue, but to ask questions. Some were surprised to learn about the exception clause. Others simply appreciated his willingness to engage in honest dialogue. Even longtime friends who had stayed silent during the previous meeting reached out to express their support. One of them, Mark, stopped by one evening with a six-pack of beer and a grin. "I've known you for years, John," Mark said as they sat on the porch. "And I know you're not the kind of guy who'd break a rule intentionally. If anyone deserves a second look, it's you." With each passing day, John could feel the tide turning. The tension that had hung heavy in the air after the meeting began to lift, replaced by a renewed sense of camaraderie. When the date for the next HOA meeting arrived, John walked into the community center feeling cautiously optimistic. This time, the atmosphere was different. People greeted him warmly, and several neighbors gave him encouraging nods as he took his seat. When the chairperson called the meeting to order, John stood up and addressed the group. He explained the history of Section 3.2b, including the Forgotten Exception Clause, and emphasized that enforcing rules should go hand in hand with fairness and understanding. Then, instead of asking for special treatment, he framed his request as a test case, a chance to demonstrate how flexibility could strengthen, rather than weaken, the community. "We wrote these guidelines to bring us closer together," he concluded. "Let's use them to build bridges, not walls." The room fell silent for a moment before breaking into murmurs of agreement. For the first time in weeks, John felt a glimmer of hope. As John finished speaking, the room remained quiet for a moment, the weight of his words hanging in the air. He could see the wheels turning in people's minds as they processed what he'd said. Some nodded thoughtfully, while others exchanged glances with their neighbors. It was clear that his message had struck a chord. For years, the HOA had focused on enforcing rules rigidly, often without considering the human element behind them. But now, John had reminded everyone why those rules existed in the first place: to foster unity and cooperation, not to create division. Finally, Sarah broke the silence. "I think John makes a good point," she said, standing up. "We've all been so focused on following the rules exactly as they're written that we've forgotten the spirit behind them. Maybe it's time we took a step back and looked at the bigger picture." Her comments sparked a lively discussion. One by one, residents began sharing their thoughts. Greg, who had initially been skeptical, admitted that he'd never considered how exceptions might actually strengthen the community rather than weaken it. Another neighbor pointed out that John's long-standing contributions to the neighborhood, both as an HOA founder and a caring neighbor, deserved recognition. Even the chairperson acknowledged that the rules weren't meant to be set in stone, but should evolve with the needs of the community. After nearly an hour of debate, the board called for a vote. They proposed granting John an exemption under the exception clause, provided he agreed to certain conditions. Asterisk. The Serenity asterisk would need to be kept clean and well-maintained, and its placement in the driveway couldn't obstruct views or cause inconvenience to others. John readily accepted these terms, knowing they were fair and reasonable. When the votes were tallied, the decision was unanimous. The room erupted into applause, and several neighbors came forward to shake John's hand. For the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of relief wash over him. Not just because he'd won the right to keep his boat where it was, but because the neighborhood had come together to find a solution that worked for everyone. After the meeting, John lingered behind to thank those who had supported him. Sarah gave him a warm hug, saying, "You did more than fix your own problem, John. You reminded us all what this community is really about." Others echoed her sentiment, expressing gratitude for the way John had handled the situation with grace and patience. Walking home that evening, John felt lighter than he had in days. The battle over the Serenity had been exhausting, but it had also taught him something valuable. Conflict doesn't have to drive people apart. Sometimes it can bring them closer together. By approaching the issue with humility and a willingness to listen, he had turned a potential wedge into an opportunity for growth. The next morning, as John sat on his porch sipping coffee, he noticed a few neighbors stopping by to chat. Some congratulated him on the outcome, while others simply wanted to catch up. The tension that had once filled the air seemed to have dissolved, replaced by a renewed sense of connection. Even the Serenity still parked proudly in his driveway, seemed to shine a little brighter under the morning sun. For John, the victory wasn't just about keeping his boat where it was about proving that even the smallest disagreements could lead to meaningful change when approached with empathy and understanding. And though the road ahead wouldn't always be smooth, he felt confident that his neighborhood was stronger now than it had been before. In the weeks that followed the HOA meeting, John noticed subtle but significant changes in the neighborhood. Conversations that once revolved around complaints and grievances began to shift toward collaboration and creativity. Neighbors who had previously kept to themselves started reaching out more often, sharing ideas about how to improve the community without causing friction. The boat issue hadn't just been resolved. It had sparked a ripple effect of goodwill and renewed purpose. One Saturday morning, as John worked on the Serenity in his driveway, a group of kids from down the street approached him, their eyes wide with curiosity. "Can we see your boat?" one of them asked shyly. Smiling, John invited them over, showing them the engine, explaining how it worked, and even letting them climb aboard. By the end of the afternoon, they were laughing and asking endless questions. It was a small moment, but it reminded John of why he loved living here. This place wasn't just a collection of houses. It was a tapestry of lives intertwined. Inspired by the renewed sense of connection, The HOA decided to form a special committee to review outdated regulations and adapt them to modern realities. Sarah suggested naming it the Unity Committee, and the name stuck. John volunteered to serve on it, eager to ensure that future rules would reflect the needs and values of the entire community. At its first meeting, the committee tackled everything from pet policies to landscaping guidelines, focusing not just on enforcement, but also on fairness and flexibility. As word spread about the Unity Committee's efforts, other neighborhoods began taking notice. The local newspaper featured an article about Lakeside Community, highlighting how they had turned a potential conflict into an opportunity for growth. The story resonated with readers, many of whom reached out to share similar struggles within their own HOAs. Some even asked for advice on fostering better communication among neighbors. To John's surprise, he found himself becoming something of a spokesperson for grassroots problem solving. But perhaps the most profound change happened within John himself. The ordeal had forced him to reflect deeply on his role in the community, not just as a rule maker or enforcer, but as a neighbor and friend. He realized that leadership wasn't about having all the answers. It was about listening, learning, and finding common ground. And while he still cherished his quiet mornings on the porch, he now looked forward to the spontaneous conversations and shared moments that made life richer. By summer's end, the neighborhood felt different, lighter, warmer, more connected. People organized potluck dinners, weekend cleanup events, and even a lakeside picnic where the Serenity took center stage. As John watched families gather around the water, laughing and enjoying each other's company, he couldn't help but feel proud. This was what he'd always hoped for when he helped build this community, a place where people cared not only about their homes, but also about each other. Looking back, John saw the boat incident not as a mistake, but as a turning point. It had reminded everyone, including himself, that rules are tools, not chains. When applied with empathy and understanding, they could bring people together rather than drive them apart. And though the Serenity remained parked in his driveway, it no longer symbolized conflict. Instead, it stood as a testament to resilience, compromise, and the power of coming together. Life returned to its predictable rhythm, but with a new layer of meaning. John still woke up at 6:30 every morning, brewed his coffee, and sat on the porch to watch the sunrise. Only now, as he gazed out at the lake, he did so with a deeper appreciation for the beauty of human connection, and the knowledge that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can create the biggest waves of change.